Olivia Pierce was a 34-year-old audiologist, known for her ability to discern even the faintest sounds. She had always been obsessed with the idea of sound, how it could shape memories, influence emotions, and even affect one's mind. After a traumatic event in her childhood where she lost her brother in a car accident, Liv's fixation grew stronger. The quiet moments of life were intolerable for her, and she began seeking out the deepest silences, convinced that something in the void would speak to her. To aid her research, Liv moved into a secluded house on the outskirts of a small town, hoping to create an environment with the perfect balance of sound and silence. Olivia had been living in the house for months, conducting experiments with various sound frequencies, isolating herself from the world. One evening she stumbled upon an old sound recording on a second-hand tape player she found at a local flea market. The tape, aged and fragile, was marked with a single word: silence. Curious, Liv played the recording. At first it was just static, but soon the static turned into a soft, almost melodic hum, a strange frequency that seemed to vibrate in her bones. It was unlike anything she had ever heard. Over the next few days, Liv began to feel the effects of the sound on her mind. She felt increasingly disoriented, as if the sound was reaching beyond her ears and pulling at her very thoughts. It wasn't just the hum anymore. She could hear whispers, voices that seemed to be beckoning her, calling her name in a language she didn't understand. The sounds were constant, always present in the background of her life. And yet when she would turn around or search for the source, there was nothing. The world around her seemed to distort, distorted images, shadows lingering longer than they should. One night, in a fit of desperation, Liv locked herself in her soundproofed study and played the tape again, cranking up the volume to drown out the madness in her mind. As she listened, the voices grew louder, clearer, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were commands. They told her to come to the source. In a trance-like state, she followed their call, walking deeper into the forest near her house, the fog thick and suffocating. The next day, the authorities found her abandoned house, her equipment scattered across the floor, but Liv was nowhere to be found. The only thing that remained was the old tape player, now silent. No one could explain what happened to her, and her disappearance became another unsolved mystery, with only the faintest echoes of her voice left in the wind, lost in the silence. Victor Carrington was a historian and expert in Victorian architecture. At 40 years old, he had devoted his life to preserving historical sites and uncovering the hidden stories behind old estates. His most recent project was a sprawling mansion, Glenmore Manor, which had been abandoned for decades. Victor had spent years studying the estate's blueprints, researching the people who lived there, and gathering stories from local folklore. The manor was said to be haunted, with rumors of strange happenings dating back to the 1800s. Most historians dismissed these stories, but Victor was determined to uncover the truth and restore the manor to its former glory. Victor arrived at Glenmore Manor on a rainy evening, ready to spend the weekend documenting the property. The mansion stood tall and imposing, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the abyss. As he explored the dusty rooms and crumbling hallways, he uncovered signs of old, forgotten lives: a child's toy, a woman's brooch, the remnants of a fire in the hearth. But what intrigued him most were the journals he found locked away in a hidden compartment in the library. The journals belonged to a woman named Eleanor Blackwood, the last known occupant of the house. She described unsettling events, whispers from the walls, cold drafts that chilled her to the bone, and the feeling of being watched. Eleanor wrote about an entity, a dark figure who appeared at the edges of her vision, always lurking in the shadows. She described the figure as having no face, only an empty space where its features should have been, and she feared it was not merely haunting the house, but feeding on her terror. Intrigued, Victor stayed in the manor that night, his curiosity pushing him to experience the strange phenomena for himself. He spent hours combing through the house, listening for sounds, staring into the dark corners where Eleanor had described seeing the Watcher. By midnight, the atmosphere in the manor had grown thick with a sense of unease. The temperature dropped, and Victor could hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty halls, though he was alone. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed the back of his neck. Victor turned to find nothing, but the air seemed to shimmer with an oppressive presence. Panicked, he fled to the library, only to find the door locked behind him. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, and the figure emerged from the dark, its faceless head tilting as it observed him. Victor tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. The figure moved closer, and just as Victor reached for the door handle, the entity lunged, its cold, empty grasp wrapping around his body. The next morning, the manor was silent once again. Victor was gone, and there were no signs of a struggle. His research was left behind, his notes scattered on the floor as if he had been interrupted mid-thought. No one ever saw him again, and Glenmore Manor remained as it always had, a place where the Watcher waited patiently for the next curious soul to wander in. Claire Holloway, 28, was a talented but struggling artist, constantly in search of inspiration. Her works often explored the theme of identity, using portraits and self-portraits to examine the nuances of how people see themselves versus how they are seen by others. Recently, she had been feeling disconnected from her art, as if the spark that once fueled her creativity had been snuffed out. She decided to move to a new apartment in a quiet part of the city, hoping a change of scenery would reignite her passion. The apartment, while charming, had an unsettling feature: a large antique mirror in the hallway that seemed to draw her attention more than it should. From the moment Claire moved into her new apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about the mirror. It was beautiful, framed in dark, intricate wood, but there was something unsettling about its reflection. It wasn't the usual distorted reflections she had seen in old mirrors, but something deeper, like it held an essence, a presence that didn't belong. Claire ignored the sensation at first, but after a few weeks she began to notice odd things. At night, she would sometimes see movement in the reflection, though she knew she was alone. One evening, after returning from a long day, Claire stood in front of the mirror, staring at her own reflection. The figure in the glass stared back, but there was something off. Her reflection's eyes seemed hollow. It blinked, but its gaze remained fixed on her. Claire's heart raced, and she quickly turned away, but when she glanced back, the reflection remained, watching her with an unblinking stare. The next night, unable to resist, Claire decided to confront whatever was happening. She stood in front of the mirror for hours, watching her reflection, willing it to do something, anything. But it was always the same. Motionless, cold, frustrated, she reached out to touch the glass. The moment her fingers made contact, a cold jolt of energy surged through her, and her reflection smiled, an eerie, unnatural smile that didn't match her own face. Horrified, Claire tried to pull her hand away, but it was stuck. The reflection in the mirror began to move independently, stepping out of the glass and into the hallway. It reached for Claire with hands that looked like her own, but colder, darker. The moment the reflection touched her, it was as if her essence was being drained from her body. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness, the air thickening around her. When the authorities arrived days later, they found Claire's apartment empty, the mirror cracked in several places. There was no sign of her, except for the faint imprint of her hands on the glass, as if she had tried to escape, but had been pulled in. No one ever found Claire, and the mirror remained abandoned, watching for the next victim. Jason Miller was a 40-year-old journalist and travel blogger with a passion for uncovering urban legends and unsolved mysteries. He made a name for himself by investigating remote, abandoned places and writing about his experiences. His latest interest was Hollow Creek, a small, nearly forgotten village deep in the mountains. According to local folklore, the village had been abandoned overnight after a series of strange disappearances, and people claimed to have seen a dark figure lurking near the creek during the full moon. Jason arrived at Hollow Creek with his camera and notebook, eager to uncover the truth behind the legend. The village was eerily quiet, the buildings crumbling under the weight of time. As Jason explored, he felt as if the land itself was watching him. The trees cast long, sinister shadows that seemed to move with him. On the outskirts of the village, he came across an old, overgrown cemetery. The gravestones were worn and illegible, but one caught his eye, a large stone, cracked down the center, with the words, "The Visitor," etched into it. Beneath it, there was a name, but it was too faded to read. Intrigued, Jason began to investigate further, photographing the grave and its strange inscription. That night, as Jason camped near the creek, he began to hear faint whispers in the wind. The whispers seemed to call his name, growing louder with every passing minute. He looked around, but the forest was silent, the fog thickening as the moon rose high. Then from the mist, a figure appeared, a tall, dark silhouette standing by the creek, motionless. Jason grabbed his camera and approached, but as he got closer, the figure's features became clearer. It was wearing a tattered cloak, its face obscured by shadows, but its eyes glowed faintly, piercing the fog. Jason called out, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move toward him, its steps slow and deliberate. Suddenly, the earth beneath Jason's feet gave way, and he found himself tumbling into the creek. The water was freezing, the current strong and relentless, dragging him deeper. As he fought to keep his head above water, he saw the figure standing at the edge of the creek, watching him with those glowing eyes. The next morning, the creek was calm again, and Jason's equipment was found washed up on the shore. But there was no sign of him, only the faintest trace of his footsteps leading into the woods, where they vanished into nothing. No one ever found out what happened to Jason, and Hollow Creek remained as it had always been. A place of forgotten memories and lingering shadows, waiting for the next visitor. Hey, if you liked this video and want more content, please do like, comment, and subscribe. Also, if you want to share some of your personal scary stories, email us using the email in the description. Haunt you later.